Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily chat show featuring the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everyone. How time flies. 14 years ago, a long 14 years, we did our first show when Keen On was the first video show actually launched on TechCrunch TV. It was in June of 2010, and it featured my old friend Nick Carr, who had a book out just then, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, a book called The Shallows, and he argued that when we read stuff online, we don't go deep. We only skim the surface, and it doesn't do justice to our brains. Over the last 14 years, of course, that debate has gone on. Not just reading on the internet, reading digitally versus reading physically. The digital versus the analog debate is endless. One man who has been very much a feature of that debate is my guest today, John R. MacArthur, otherwise known as Rick MacArthur, is the publisher of Harper's magazine, the oldest, I think, American continual magazine. And very much of an outspoken defender of the analog world. And he had a really interesting piece earlier this year in The Guardian on why kids learn better on paper than on screens. And he's joining us from the Harper's office in New York City. Rick, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
So, before we get to your piece, tell me why you've always been so suspicious of digital.
Well, actually, it started in San Francisco. I think I was somewhere in the Bay Area. Louis Lapham and I were out pitching something to somebody, trying to get advertising. I'm not sure what. And we were in a restaurant. This must have been around 2000 or maybe just before 2000, before the turn of the century. And we were in this beautiful, manicured sort of Bay Area restaurant. I wish I could remember the name of it. And I overheard a conversation at the table next to me of what I assumed to be 3 or 4 internet entrepreneurs. And they started talking about platforms and this form and that form and so on. And my ears perked up, and so did Louis's. And Louis, you know, he's a reporter. He started out at the San Francisco Examiner, actually. So he just jumped into their conversation to say, tell us more about the internet and your entrepreneurial ideas and so on and so forth. And they said, well, depends on your platform or something like that, or I forget what jargon they were using in 2000. It kept changing. And my body tightened up, and I said, these are con men. There's something about these people that says con men all over them. Now, they weren't entirely con men, but if you'll recall, there was a tremendous internet funding bubble in 2000. So it must have been around that time when people were launching these crazy IPOs and companies and getting millions and millions of dollars without any kind of business plan or any kind of balance sheet that suggested they'd ever make money. So I wasn't wrong that a lot of them were con men. But the biggest con men or the biggest pirates have cornered the market. And those guys, you know, they started Google and Facebook and Apple and so on and so forth. So I remember at that moment being very, I don't know, something in me just revolted against their tone.
Has there been a change, Rick, over, well, certainly since 2000 or even since 2010 when this show launched, in the zeitgeist? Back then, when anyone criticized digital, and I was an early critic too, although I had my own startup in the 90s, so I'm not immune to the seductive quality of the digital revolution. Do you think there has been a shift in how people think about it? A couple of weeks ago, there was a huge debate over the new Apple iPad ad, and it focused on the way in which the Apple Crush ad is supposedly destroying creators. And interestingly enough, TechCrunch, where my show launched, which has always been a cheerleader for the digital revolution, was actually rather critical. Has the zeitgeist shifted over the last 12, 15 years when it comes to digital broadly?
Well, I'd say one is it's a harsh dose of reality for creative people who write for a living or write music or take pictures or try to do art, that the cost, that what they do has become a commodity, a pure commodity, and the price has been driven, the price of the commodity and of their labor has been driven down to pennies. I mean, you can't make a living anymore writing or painting or taking pictures or even writing lyrics. I don't know. There's a great statistic. I'm way out of date, but it's the membership of the National Lyric Writers Association collapsed in the last 10 or 15 years because songwriters were getting ripped off by Google, and you couldn't protect anything you wrote. So thus you couldn't make any money as a songwriter anymore. So I think the small fry, and I would include myself as one of the small fry, have realized that it's a game rigged to enrich the super rich, the people who cornered the market, Sergey Brin and so on, and Jeff Bezos and so on. And it's not a place for creative outlet in the sense of a career where you where you can make money. Now, I'm not saying nobody's doing anything interesting on the internet. It's certainly possible, but you cannot make a living as an ordinary creator on the internet anymore. Or maybe you could at the very beginning, but you certainly can't anymore. So I think there's a real cynicism has taken hold. In fact, the cover story in Harper's this month, just gone off the newsstand, The Life and Death of Hollywood, is all about the destruction of the last class of writers who could make a living.
Right. We had Daniel Bessner as an excellent guest on the show weeks ago.
Right. So I think there's a where there was some kind of idealism and excitement about the internet. It goes to the four corners of the world. It costs nothing, and so you can talk to everybody whenever you want to. Has been replaced by a deep and kind of corrosive cynicism. I'm fighting. I'm on the offensive. I'm not. I never believed in it to begin with. So I've witnessed the destruction it's caused, and I've been fighting ever since, trying to find ways to survive and to counterattack.
Harper's is kind of on the internet, Rick. Again, you don't need me to tell you this, but you haven't really embraced it. You note that you can't make a living online. Some online publishers, though, seem to do a reasonably good job. The New York Times, The Atlantic, one of your magazine competitors. Well, is it really impossible to make a living online these days as a creator?
The New York Times is enjoying a Trump bubble, an anti-Trump bubble. They've been able to, if you subscribe to the New York Times, it's a vote against Trump. That's the way they were selling themselves, and that's worked up to a point for them. But Apple, Atlantic's losing money. It's a privately held company. If they say they're making money, they're lying. They're subsidized again by the widow Jobs. I mean, Steve Jobs' widow owns the Atlantic.
Recycling the money like the Washington Post.
So she cannot lose money. I mean, she can lose as much money as she wants, and it doesn't make any difference. And she's an internet beneficiary. She's a legacy internet beneficiary, like Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, but the rest of the media is in wholesale collapse. I mean, there's a newspaper folding every minute. There's an internet startup collapsing every second that claims to be picking up the slack. Local journalism is a desert. Nobody's doing any reporting anymore. And the only survivors at this point are the people who stuck to having a real paywall from the beginning. Harper's, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times almost fatally gave everything away in the first 5 or 10 years of internet publication, and they realized they made a terrible mistake. And I don't know if this is too much inside baseball for you, but in my career as a publisher, I've had to sell a lot of advertising space. And I realized that the ad salesman, I'm sure in the beginning, thought, oh, the internet's great. The cost per thousand is going to drop to nothing for the buyer of my space. And we'll be able to reach, and our audience is going to increase exponentially to every English speaking or every English reading person in the world. But of course, it didn't work that way. Google took everything and retailed it on their own. They took everything that we were producing and they sold it. Them and Facebook sold it to advertisers much more efficiently, much more cheaply, without sharing a nickel or a dime with us. Yes, Apple, the widow Jobs is going to continue subsidizing the Atlantic as long as it amuses her. Bezos, I think, will continue publishing the Washington Post because he knows it intimidates Congress, and he has to watch out for congressmen getting mad at him, trying to sue him or legislate against Amazon's monopoly. But for the most part, the media business is a catastrophe right now. And all of the companies that used to be held up to me as the future, BuzzFeed, Vice, I wrote a column making fun of all these names. There's something very childish about it. Google. It's like it sounded like sort of a Rugrats cartoon or something, a Rugrats episode. Just crazy devotion to this idea that if you did enough innovative stuff on your website and got enough people to click on it, you could become as rich as Sergey Brin.
Rick, what do you make of the latest fad for platforms like, and I use that word, I know it's not your favorite word, platform, but I don't know another word, for like Substack, where creatives, writers, musicians can establish direct relations with their readers and their fans, and they can pay them directly. Some people, Andrew Sullivan, for example, seem to be doing quite well out of that.
Yeah, I'm all for it. I lament it because what Substack does is what the internet does, generally speaking. It silos information. In other words, you got to know about Matt Taibbi and be a fan of Matt Taibbi to find him and to read him. Whereas in the old days, in the good old days, anybody could pick up a copy of Rolling Stone on any newsstand in the country, and there was an article by Matt Taibbi, and he could be introduced to a more general audience and educate a more general audience. Now he's preaching to the converted. He's only writing for people who love what Matt Taibbi has to say. My idea of a good time is being confronted, publishing something that gets people upset, that they disagree with, or that they'll hit back over. And I force myself to read all sorts of newspapers and editorial pages that I object to, because I want to know what other people are saying. I'm interested. I think it's exciting.
Do you think it's clearly the Substack economy is good for the Taibis and Sullivans of the world, the superstar writers? But what about the middle class? It doesn't seem to be much of a middle class creative community on Substack. It seems to reflect the winner-take-all architecture of economic architecture of the digital revolution.
Yeah, it seems to me it's very much, I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to me very much similar to the music business. The superstars get richer. Barry Manilow continues to collect a nickel for every download or whatever. but these are older, established recording artists. I can't imagine that a young person starting out in the music business, or a lyric writer, as I was saying earlier, can get a foothold or can get discovered. It just sounds absolutely impossible. I know it's virtually impossible for a writer. If you have an idea for a book or a nonfiction or fiction, and you go to a publisher, it's very unlikely you're going to get an advance, first of all. And if you do get an advance, it's going to be small. And once the book is published, printed, or at least, well, printed, the publisher says to you, well, we're not going to do any PR for you or advertising. You've got to do all the social, you do your social media and you promote it. So it's getting the second book is after the first book is printed, unless you're very, very lucky, is almost impossible. So you end up becoming I can't name names, brilliant young journalist who writes for us and just won a big award.
You can name names, Rick.
Well, no. Anyway, she's a speechwriter. She's making her living as a speechwriter, for corporate executives.
So what's the alternative model? I was doing some research about you. I'm sure you're familiar. There was a piece written back in 2014 describing you as the haughty old king of Harper's, and noted that you didn't pay your writers very well. Can people who work at Harper's, can they survive?
Well, the staff can. I mean, they get salaries and free health insurance. I'm one of 1% of American companies that gives free health insurance to my employees. But freelance writers.
Oh, you do? Can I have a job?
But freelance writers, forget it. I mean, I say to them, I wish I could help you more. I mean, we're still paying at least $1 a word. But, you get one piece published in Harper's a year, or every 2 years, if you're lucky. You can't make a living on that. You got to find some other gig. You got to teach. Although, as our friend, Bessner was saying, the same thing is happening in academia. I mean,
he has a job there.
There's harder and harder to get a job as an associate professor of widgetry, certainly as associate publisher of English, that would support your writing habit. It's just becoming impossible.
So what would you say to a young person who aspires to become a writer? My daughter just graduated from Bryn Mawr, and one of her friends was the summa cum laude, one of the 2 top graduating people at Bryn Mawr, which is quite an achievement. And she asked me to help her get a job in publishing. She aspires to become a writer. Should I tell her to forget it?
Well, I can advise her to at least try book publishing, because books, and we're going to get to this subject later about paper versus screen, books seem to be holding up better than newspapers and magazines. They're not being run out of business as easily as newspapers and magazines are being run out of business. However, there's been a tremendous concentration in the book business in the last 20 years. Fewer and fewer publishers, and fewer interesting jobs, and fewer interesting minds like Morgan Entrekin, your publisher, who are willing to take a risk on somebody because they just think it's interesting and fun, and that's what publishing is about.
Although, interestingly enough, about Morgan, he's also an investor in LitHub, a very successful digital platform where this show is distributed. So he bets both sides. I mean, there's no reason why if you commit to print, you can't also commit to digital.
Well, and one of the things I did, I was accused of being this terrible retrograde dinosaur from the beginning. Rick MacArthur hates the internet, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as I saw the possibilities, I said, one thing that we might be able to make money off of, and I think we are, broadly speaking, profiting from it, is by digitizing the entire archive of Harper's Magazine going back to 1850, and then indexing it professionally. So we now have the most sophisticated indexed archive of any magazine in the country. You can type in, Herman Melville, whatever, Moby Dick, and what's the word I'm searching for right now? Exorcism, and everything. Exorcism, and anything that we ever wrote about those three subjects will pop up on the index, and you can look them up. And I think that's a wonderful thing to have instant access to.
Well, the magazine's been going since June 1850.
Right.
Let's get then, Rick, to...
And also get the Andy Warhol illustrations. Andy Warhol did 3 illustrations for Harper's, and pretty soon we'll have all the artists indexed as well. Sorry.
Yeah, it's an important point, because I think one of the other casualties of digital is memory. So much of what was published. I mean, I found my piece from TechCrunch from 2010, but a lot of the stuff that I published over the last 15 years online has disappeared. And even that haughty old king of Harper's, that one is very hard to find, because Gawker has gone out of business, actually sued by Peter Thiel. So there's a story there. Let's get, Rick, to your piece on this groundbreaking study, which, let's be clear, you partially funded, that shows kids learn better on paper than on screens. Tell us about this study. I know it's out this week, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be published on the, I forget, what are we today? Anyway, the 22nd of August.
Yeah, May. So it's published, I think, today.
In any event, it comes out of a speech I gave at the Columbia Journalism School about 11 years ago, a Delacorte lecture. And I don't know, during the Q&A, somebody challenged my position on the destructive power of the internet. I don't know. Anyway, and of reading on screens. Anyway, I later on, it just occurred to me in front of this audience, that somebody, and I said it out loud, somebody ought to do a neuroscientific study, a controlled study of reading on text versus reading a text on paper versus reading it on screen in a laboratory environment. And we should just get to the bottom of this. Is it really better for you, as had already been suggested in some social scientific studies, than to read on screen? So a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School from years back came up to me afterwards and said, in fact, there have been social science studies done on this, and all of them, particularly the ones conducted by a certain Anne Mangan, a Norwegian scholar, showed that people appeared to have greater comprehension.
That from the University of Stavanger, of all places.
There you go.
There she is. Great Anne Mangan.
Right. And clearly people remembered more of what they read if it was a printed text than if it was on the screen, and seemed to comprehend more. There are other studies in the same ballpark. Also on handwriting, that there's an advantage to learning to write by hand than to keyboard the letters. But anyway, I'm sending these fairly turgid scientific or social scientific studies around the country around the world to my friends, saying, "Isn't this interesting?" Because at that point, I recognize Google as the existential threat that it is, and I said, "Wouldn't it be interesting if it turned out that everything the internet salesmen are selling you is wrong? In other words, we're really better off reading it in a book or on a piece of paper or in a newspaper or whatever in terms of retention." And that goes for not just for general readers, but also for the repairman who's called to repair Chernobyl. Where did he learn his repair technique?
Surely there wasn't a manual there when those guys showed up at Chernobyl.
When he was in graduate school, was he reading it reading his repair techniques in a book, in a textbook, or was he looking at YouTube? So anyway, I was getting nowhere. And finally, a public policy friend of mine said, "You're not going to get anywhere unless you get a neuroscientific study done, because no one will take the social science seriously." So I got friends together at Columbia University to hash this out. and a team of neuroscientists at Teachers College, which is the School of Education at Columbia, volunteered to do this study if I could raise the money. They wrote up a proposal.
And Karen
Froud, who is your fellow English woman, she's from she's from Merseyside. She's from somewhere north of Liverpool. She said, "Yeah, I'll do it." But where am I going to get the money? So I did raise most of the money from an old dinosaur, like even more of a dinosaur than me, Vartan Gregorian, who'd been head of the New York Public Library.
Mm.
And he signed off on the grant the day before he died. It's an interesting anecdote. And they went ahead and they did their study. They had to create texts that they thought were appropriate for 10 to 12-year-olds, because they think that's the key period of development in reading, is 10 to 12 years old. When you're
about fourth grade, is that right?
Yeah. Well, they were saying sort of 5th to 7th grade.
Okay.
And because they refer to it as a study of middle schoolers. In any event, and these kids are all, of course, fluent in computerese and so on and so forth. So they put these kids in a room with a hairnet on that's full of electrodes that have to be attached to their heads. They have them read the same text on screen and then on text and then on paper, and they read their brain waves on it. They read their EEGs on a screen out in the lab while they're doing it. And it's a very complicated control, which I cannot explain to you. But after a year of this, because they had to do it during COVID, which was very difficult, they finally got a big enough sample, 60 kids roughly. And Karen calls me up one day and says, it turns out it's what the social scientists have been saying is true. There's clearly deeper reading going on when they're reading it on paper. And believe me, Karen Froud and her colleagues are not nostalgic for the good old days of paper. They don't want to go back to the monastery and read under candlelight. They're modern scientists. They're not nostalgic. But they have convincing evidence, and you have to read their scientific paper, which is just being published today in +1. You can also read my story in The Guardian about the unpublished, about the study when it was unpublished. And it is, I think, convincing evidence. It's a start. It's not absolutely finally conclusive, but it's convincing evidence that there is a clear advantage to reading on paper, that you are deep. Because you're reading more deeply, you're comprehending more, and you're remembering.
Some people, Rick, might be listening or hearing this and saying, "Wow, of course that's going to be the outcome." This guy who spent half his life screaming and shouting about digital, about what a disaster it is, funds a study that suggests that kids are reading or learning more from reading physically than digitally. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would again go back to the social science. All the social scientific studies were showing the same thing before I ever got involved, and I still haven't met Anne Mangan. I want to meet her.
But you have to go to Norway to meet
her.
her.
To come here, but Karen Froud has integrity, and I said, let the chips fall where they may. If it turns out that reading on screen is better or the same as reading on paper, then go ahead. Let's go all digital. What difference does it make?
Well, Nick Carr was right in the shadows.
Absolutely. And of course, anecdotally, I'm sure everybody has a friend who will tell them that when it happens to me all the time when I'm writing on the screen, I make mistakes and I skip words. I drop entire words, certainly I drop letters that if I'm handwriting, it doesn't happen. When I'm reading, and everybody at Harper's has learned this to their I think ultimate edification, that editing a manuscript on paper, on a printout, is much more effective and much more accurate than trying to do it on a screen. We don't know what it is about the screen, or about the lighting, or the fact that it's somewhat disembodied. We don't know enough yet about the hand brain connection. Although there's another a French neuroscientist, Jean-Luc Vallée, who I was alluding to earlier, who's done all these studies of children and learning handwriting, learning the alphabet by handwriting as opposed to keyboarding, who become better readers later in life. So it seems that anecdotally and now neuroscientifically, the evidence is all pointing in the direction of.
It's ironic, Rick. There was a New York Times piece recently about you that suggested that you still write letters, but the titans of our new world, the new ruling class, all send their kids, or seem to send their kids, to Waldorf schools. Steve Jobs did, where screens are banned and where handwriting is encouraged. So analog is still alive, isn't it? And it's rather ironic that our new overlords recognize it more than everybody else.
Yes. Oh, because they're not stupid, but they're very smart. They've cornered the market. But I should have added this when you asked me about what do I say to people who say that maybe Karen Froude's corrupt and I've corrupted their study. The real corruption is at Google, which is in this immense conflict of interest that I refer to in my Guardian piece, where they're selling Chromebooks, these cheap laptops, at a discount to public school systems, at the same time as the public school systems, like in Houston, are shutting down their libraries and getting rid of the printed books. And Google, of course, is saying, what do you need a library for? You see all the books in the back. I need it. What do you need a library for when you've got a Google Chromebook? You can get any book in the world.
Are you suggesting there's a conspiracy with Google, that they know what they're doing, or it's just accidental?
They addict people to the screen, and they target them as advertising prospects, and to enhance, shall we say, the addiction, they say to the educators who run the Houston public school system, look, you're doing these poor kids a favor. You don't, a cheap laptop that they can't afford otherwise, and they've got access to all the great works of literature and mathematics.
You're not careful, Rick. They're going to sue you, Google.
They made $14 billion in sales since 2020 on Google Chromebooks, as they encourage school systems in Long Island, Houston.
But in defense of Google, I mean, those Chromebooks are pretty affordable. I mean, what are the kids supposed to do?
Yeah, well, they're supposed to. I would make them read books. I would make them take their. I've heard from special ed teachers crying practically because they've heard about my campaign to invert I call it inverting the panic, because 20 years ago, the panic certainly among affluent parents was, oh my God, there's not enough laptops in the school, not enough whatever. And my kid has a backache from carrying books in his backpack or whatever. Now they're going to be saying, what happened to all the books? Where are they? But I've had special ed teachers say to me that their special ed students suffer because they do much better if they do slow hand written answers to trying to keep up with the algorithm on the keyboard and answer the questions on a time test. They need extra time, but they also need extra time to see what they're doing with their hand. And again, this is anecdotal, but this is something I'm told is an increasing problem for kids taking tests, that they're at a disadvantage doing it on the keyboard.
Rick, let's step back a bit. So we've talked about 2 or 3 different things today. We've talked about the crisis of a creative class. You noted that you can't make a living now as a writer, journalist, the decimation of journalism. We've also talked about how digital is undermining the way in which kids learn, that they learn much more superficially, that their reading is much poorer. The third piece of this, of course, is the crisis of democracy, incivility, and the way in which America seems to be lurching, some people might even suggest, into civil war. Are these three things connected? Is the digital revolution, the failure of the creative class, the crisis of the creative class, the impact on learning, and the shift to a populist authoritarianism in the United States? Is there a connection, or are those three independent things?
Oh, I think there's a connection, because internet learning, of course, increases remoteness. You're more likely to be doing it remotely without other people around. In a classroom where you're sharing things, you're talking to each other, you're passing people's drafts around, looking at what other people have done, and you're connecting with other people as humans. That's where you learn civility, and that's also where you learn how to debate. If you're sitting at home, one of the things I talk about in the Guardian piece is the collapse of reading scores in the last 3 years. But that's, I think, and I'd certainly due in part to lockdown and people having to sitting in their bedrooms at home with an iPhone handy and so on, pretending to follow what's going on in the classroom. But the internet also encourages quick replies, anecdotal replies. I mean, that's what Twitter is. It's getting off a line, not making a coherent argument. And you get a line up on Twitter that gets a lot of hits, gets a lot of applause. You feel good about yourself. You may not have made a coherent argument or a coherent point, but you certainly get a lot of gratification, and other people applaud you. So it has turned, I suppose, the whole concept of self-esteem, what gives us self-esteem, upside down. I feel good still about writing a coherent article or column or whatever, or book at some length, where I'm making more than just one argument or getting more than one point of view across. I also very much enjoy somebody responding to what I've said in a lengthy, serious way. The synthesis of our communication is anti-Trump. Trump is all about immediate gratification and getting off the good line, the winning line. It's not about coherence or connecting or persuasion or synthesizing 2, 3, 4, 5 good arguments into one that might make for a better world. I mean, sorry to sound old-fashioned, but I'm hoping for a better world. I see a kind of a siloing, the kind of siloing that's happening on Substack, but also when you're staring at your computer alone at home, and the kids sitting in their bedroom at home, cut off from society. It's done a lot of damage, of course, psychologically to the kids. It hasn't just hurt their reading scores. It's made them alienated.
Our age of anxiety. Finally, Rick,
and obviously an alienated consumer, I think, is more likely to fall prey to a Trump-like politician.
Finally, Rick, and there's a lot to digest here, and we'll have to have you back on the show. I love working with you and your writers at Harper's. You've always got interesting things to say. Where do we begin to address this? You're not going to be able to ban computers in schools or at home. Where are some concrete ways to address all the issues that you're so concerned with, particularly the ones that you bring up in your Guardian piece and that comes out of this white paper, the Karen Freud white paper that's been published this week?
Well, first thing is to get people reading books again, printed books, and getting professors and high school teachers to assign more challenging material. I hear this over and over again from teachers, from Harvard professors to public school teachers, saying the kids don't have the attention span anymore. And I'm giving in. I'm not pushing them. I'm giving in and giving them a shorter syllabus and less challenging material. We should be doing precisely the opposite. We should be challenging kids with more difficult and complex material. Obviously, I'm on paper, but we should be challenging them. We should be not training them to use a computer, but training them how to think critically. And that requires in-person instruction and a challenging syllabus and a challenging curriculum. Not everybody's going to become a Socratic or Platonic scholar. We're not asking that of everybody, but everybody can benefit from Socratic and Platonic approaches to reading. And the same thing goes for math and science. I mean, the greatest scientists are not, and the greatest mathematicians are not people just following rote formulas. They're people who are challenging the orthodoxy of the day in math and science, not just in literature and history. So I'm for beefing up the curriculum and making people read more difficult texts. Absolutely.
And finally, Rick, what are you reading now? What's inspiring you?
I'm rereading because I read in French and English. Also, everybody should learn a second language. I forgot to mention, there's a guy named John Gabrielli, an MIT neuroscientist who came to the Teachers College Symposium that launched this study last fall. And he said, memorably, it's in my piece, look, the salesmen are in charge, not the educators. The salesmen are in charge. But my point is, I'm reading a novel in French that I read 40 years ago, Le Père Goriot by Balzac. Yeah. And I got to tell you, reading it 40 years later, it's better, it's richer, it's more interesting than when I read it the first time. And it's a great novel. It's a great story. It's better than anything you can see on Netflix right now. In English, I forgot what I'm reading. Excuse me. I'm reading something. Oh, I'm reading a wonderful book about World War II by Elizabeth Samet, who teaches at West Point in the English department, about World War II nostalgia and historiography and how it distorts everything about our current foreign and military policy.